But out of them came a man the electorate thought it could trust.
The task and the challenge remain the same: to bring Australians together.
Bob Hawke was an Oxford scholar who'd become the trade union's main man and caught the nation's eye. An infamous larrikin who'd had to swear off the booze.
You can't be a drunkard Prime Minister. Womanising Prime Minister, frowned upon, but not as bad in the scheme of things. But one who was admitting his faults, one who's saying, look, I'm a flawed human being, OK, we'll cop that.
The man's popularity is unmatched. The ALP insists that appeal will translate into votes.
This great, almost mystical bond he had with the Australian people, that he'd go out there and people just wanted to touch the hem of his garment.
All I'm going to say now, you'll be a gawk if you don't vote for Hawke.
There was the sense, you had it yourself, the party had it, everyone had it, we were heading to victory.
Here he comes, the victorious Bob Hawke, and his wife Hazel standing in the doorway, the happiest man in Australia.
Bob Hawke had triumphed on a wave of national expectation. He now had... Bob had swept to power, promising to create jobs, provide access to education for all, and establish universal health care. But above all, he knew his government would live or die on how it managed the economy.
Mr. Hawke arrived early at Parliament House today with a lot of work to do.
Day one as PM. Instead of the $6 billion deficit he was expecting to inherit, it was in fact a whopping $9.6 billion.
No responsible incoming government can say, oh, well, there's another $3.6 billion that's been thrown at us, so that doesn't make any difference. Of course it makes a difference.
The realities of government set in pretty quickly. The fact that we were confronting a budget crisis was...
We inherited a significantly debilitated economy.
The Australian economy, when we came in, was in an absolute bloody mess. We were going to finish up the poor white trash of Asia if we didn't do some tough things.
Bob reassessed every election promise except one.
The Labor government will return to the basic principle of the right of all Australians to health services according to their medical needs.
He would not abandon Medicare.
Very hard for people now to remember the days before Medicare. It literally was the case that for poorer people, sickness was not just a physical problem, but was a financial tragedy.
But with no money in the budget, Bob needed to find a way to fund universal health care. He would turn to his old trade union mates and ask them to take a wage cut to pay for it.
It's a very big call. We won the election, we have to say to all those people, by the way, they're going to have a big reduction in real wages.
For Bob, it was a role reversal. As leader of the union movement in the 70s, he'd argued for big wage rises. Now, as Prime Minister, he was preaching restraint.
So I rang up all the union leaders and I argued the position. And it is one of the great negotiations in history, really.
These negotiations formed part of a series of groundbreaking deals known as the Accord, an agreement where the unions, led by Bill Kelty, would give up wage rises in exchange for benefits, like Medicare, which would become the defining social reform of the 1980s.
I say on behalf of the people that we represent, I think you truly are a great Prime Minister, and I think this is truly a great government.
Instead of the disputation of the 70s and the conflict, in the 80s the unions are effectively at the cabinet table. Bill Kelty was often accused in the media of being, the 20th cabinet minister or something.
The challenges are there to be met, and working together and with you, we will achieve those challenges in a way that no community, no society could ever have expected us to.
It wasn't just the unions who believed in Bob. Crucially, he also brought big business to the negotiating table.
It was the first time that guys who were CEOs of major companies had actually met trade unionists.
There was this great push to bring the institutions of power in Australia, business, the unions and government together. So everybody was in not necessarily furious agreement, but were, discussing things in a civilised way.
He didn't think in terms of winners and losers. He thought in terms of what you needed to trade off and what I needed to trade off for us to come together.
By building this consensus, the Hawke government got the economy back on track, making it more internationally competitive while still looking after the workers.
This was the way the world was going, and Australia was on the right track, but we were not going to be a rotten low-wage society like America, or a horrible Thatcherite sort of swamp like she was running.
Without a doubt, that period of the mid-80s, recognising the opportunity that the Accord provided for starting to get some wage restraint without people really hurting, was one of the really creative periods of policy making in Australia's post-war history.
Who painted this picture of a social democratic model that nobody else was adopting in the whole of the world? Nobody was saying this is what we should do. It was Hawke.
The Accord led to universal health care and one of the highest minimum wages in the world. But it also marked a watershed for the union movement.
I was opposed to it because I saw it as taking away from unions what most workers saw as the raison d'etre of unions, which is to fight for workers' wages. And to an extent, I've been, I think, proved right on that.
When Hawke was ACTU president in the 70s, trade union membership was well over half of the workforce. Come forward to today, and trade union membership is now less than 15%. But the benefit for Australian people has been absolutely immense. It is a key reason that we've had 26 years of uninterrupted growth since the early 1990s.
But the constant showman, entrenched in popular culture, also held deeply fixed moral convictions. These would be publicly tested by his Liberal opponent, John Howard.
Mr. Howard, is the rate of Asian immigration into Australia too fast?
I think there are some people who believe it is.
What do you think?
I wouldn't like to see it greater.
Australia had had its notoriously racist White Australia policy until well into the 60s. Now, John Howard was suggesting that race should once again influence our immigration quotas.
There is some concern about the pace of change involved in the present. Is entitled to take that into account.
Well, the great Asian immigration debate of 1988 was instigated by John Howard, not as an accident, not as a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate strategy. Bob Hawke was absolutely furious.
As a trade unionist, Bob had taken a strong stand against racism, and he wasn't going to back down now.
Mr. Howard can't have it both ways. He can't, 12 months ago, as does his leader in this state of New South Wales, stress a commitment to multiculturalism and then, sleazily, 12 months later, because he perceives there may be some advantage in some sectors of the Australian community, to walk away from it. It's both morally repugnant and it's economically insane. I will have no bar of it.
We actually look at it in isolation. It didn't seem at the time, perhaps even to many people now, as being particularly radical, but it obviously was seen and was used as exhibiting some kind of bias against people on the basis of their race.
The policy would enable a future coalition government to vary the flow of people from any part of the world, and I emphasise any.
Once he'd said that, there was only one place to deal with, that was in the Parliament. We'll debate this in the National House. We will debate where we stand in terms of immigration generally, Chinese immigration specifically. I will make this an incredible debate. He said, I'll knock the bastard over. I said, you will? He said, I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will. And I went home. I went home with an enormous sense of pride.
Good evening from Paul Murphy and welcome to PM, which comes to you tonight from the magnificent new $1 billion Parliament House in Canberra.
He saw that this was such a big moment. He said, mate, I just want you to come and sit in the advisor's box while I make this speech. And there I was, sitting in the new Parliament House, in what was really one of the most momentous times in modern history.
Let me make it clear, I do not accuse Mr. Howard of racism or of being a racist. Sadly, I make the more serious charge, I make the more damning indictment, the charge of cynical opportunism. In a cynical grab for voters, he has unleashed within his own coalition and within the wider community the most malevolent, the most hurtful, the most damaging, the most uncohesive forces. Far from one Australia, he has guaranteed a divided Australia.
Several of my colleagues crossed the floor. It was difficult. And I said later that I had not handled it very well. And I accepted that. It did me damage, and the Labor Party sought to exploit it by moving a resolution sort of declaring that race should never be a criteria, and that was obviously designed to split us.
Well, we found racism abhorrent, and there's no question that Howard flirted with it. He got over it, but he flirted with it, and Hawke knocked him down. And I think that was one of the great things that Hawke did, because Australia's a better place because he did that.
Now you're on the record, you've already said that you would fight an election on this issue. Do you think that that's what you'll be doing?
Avoid the issue. If it's still there, I will take it on head on. Because of my belief in the fundamental decency of the Australian people will win.
I just found it totally offensive in a moral sense personally. So I took no notice of those who said, look, go easy. It's not the sort of thing on which one goes easy.
Hawke's enthusiasm for Asia had been fuelled during his first visit to China in 1978.
And I was very fortunate because that 78 was the year that Deng Xiaoping made the single most important decision made by any political leader in the world in the 20th century. And that was to move the Chinese economy towards a market economy and open up to the outside world. That lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty.
And created a huge new potential market.
He could get a sense of how significant Asia was going to be in Australia's future, and we couldn't go on looking to the traditional relationships with Europe. We had to, be much more, part of the region.
Hawke's awareness of China's significance was a key step towards it becoming our #1 trading partner.
Before he left Beijing, he strolled across Tiananmen Square to the Great Hall of the People for an biggest ever foreign investment.
There's $5 billion worth of iron ore lying in the dirt of China. Treasure house, Mr. Hugh declared today. We share it together, said Bob Hawke. China's appetite for iron ore is increasing rapidly under its modernisation program.
But just as things were taking off, Hawke would face one of the greatest tests of his career.
Columns of troops, many jacketless for their jog march from the city's outskirts, converged on Tiananmen Square. They were met by an estimated 1 million people.
Pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in Beijing.
Amazing as it may seem, people's power has turned back the People's Army for the second time in 2 weeks.
Thousands of student protesters occupied the city's main square in a tense standoff with Chinese authorities.
Tanks are rolling in down the main thoroughfare towards Tiananmen Square.
As the world watched, events would take a sickening turn.
The Beijing massacre, unarmed civilians being gunned down by the People's Liberation Army.
We don't want the army, we don't want the gunshots and the fight. You know, I mean, firing at the innocent people.
Freedom! Freedom! Democracy! Democracy!
In Australia, Chinese students also took to the streets. With one of our most important trading relationships between playing it safe or speaking out.
The Australian ambassador in Beijing sent in a very descriptive cable about what happened at Tiananmen Square, including tanks rolling over people.
Hawke called for a public memorial at Parliament House that was televised across the nation.
The Prime Minister was determined to go into the Great Hall of Parliament and to take the cable with him. The office was concerned that he would become overly emotional, and they worked very hard at seeking to stop him doing it.
This is at once the saddest and the most compelling duty I've had to perform as Prime Minister.
Hawke was, I think, a pretty compassionate fella. Not genuinely compassionate, not politically compassionate, because even if it was going to hurt him, he still wore his heart in his sleeve.
Foot soldiers went through the square, bayoneting or shooting anybody who was still alive. They had orders that nobody in the square be spared, and children and young girls were slaughtered as mercilessly as the many wounded soldiers from other units there. Anti-personnel carriers and tanks then ran backwards and forwards over the bodies of the slain, in to push the remains into piles, which were then incinerated by troops with flamethrowers.
I've never really been embarrassed by it. Just as in Massacre, tears do come to me somewhat more readily than they do to a lot of other people. That was me. It's part of the warts and all picture. It's heartbroken for China and for the Chinese people. Well, I can't talk about things like that without just putting myself there and seeing young people killed.
I call on the Chinese government to respect the will of its people, to crush the spirit and the body of youth is to crush the very future of China itself.
When I came off, this bureaucrat, I've forgotten who it was, said, "Prime Minister, you can't do that." I said, "I've done it. That's the way it's going to be."
Bob Hawke had conviction, a set of beliefs that are right for the time and a set of beliefs that you will enact when you are in government. Conviction overrode polls. And that's the missing ingredient today.
Within days of his speech, Hawke would confirm that all Chinese students in Australia would have their visas extended to protect them against any possible reprisal. Chin Jin is one of those students.
All Chinese nationals, no matter they stayed in Australia legally or illegally, will not be sent back to China against their own will. This country can be my country. I can stay.
What the response to Tiananmen Square did was to effectively double the number of Chinese born in Australia, and that effectively laid the platform for the size of the community today.
I think lots of Chinese people regard him just like a beloved father.
In many ways, when we think back on this was a bit of a watershed call. We talked the talk about our commitment to Asia and our willingness to see lots of Asian faces in our streets and our universities and everywhere else. But here it was actually doing it, and doing it in a way which was clearly going to have long-term repercussions.
4 years later, Bob Hawke went back to China.
I walked in, and as I walked in, Jiang Zemin got up, walked around to me, came and held out his hand. He said, "Mr. Hawke, there's one thing I want to say to you." And I thought, shit, what's this? And he said, "Mr. Hawke, China never forgets its friends, and we want you to know that we regard you as one of our best friends." So, you see, they'd understood that my heart had been broken for China and for the Chinese people.
Bob had followed his heart on racism and China.
We forget now, but there were many, many people out on the streets of Australian cities and towns saying we need to better look after the natural environment. Hawke himself didn't have a particularly green bone in his body from an early stage. You know, he'd be out and about and people would tell him what they thought and he'd listen. He's a listener. You know, you can see that the Bob brain is sort of, you know, that's the way it works.
Hawke first took action in 1983 when he intervened to stop the Tasmanian government from damming the Franklin River.
If you look at the dam as a dam, it is at one and the same time an environmental obscenity and an economic absurdity. And it shouldn't proceed on either the grounds of environment or of economics.
This was an issue for Australia as a whole. It wasn't just an issue for Tasmania. It was resonating very strongly around the country.
He's the first leader in our time who actually basically just stepped out and said, I'm going to make a really strong action to protect the environment. You know, damn the consequences, that's what I'm going to do.
I think you only have to look around here, see the environment. To talk of mining in this area is just unacceptable.
Expanding Kakadu National Park and putting it on the World Heritage List. Protecting Shelburne Bay and the Daintree rainforests, protecting Jervis Bay. And Hawke essentially was prepared to face down state premiers. He was prepared to face down sections of the union movement in order to do these big, important saves on environment.
Now, fighting is not what most people like to do, to be honest. Even a lot of left people, they talk about it.
And Bob would go looking for a fight after being told about an international agreement his government was preparing to sign.
I said, Bob, there's a submission here that would have Australia sign up to a minerals convention that would allow mining in Antarctica.
Mining the Antarctic, they must be off their collective bloody heads.
Bob began his own 2-year crusade, lobbying world leaders to sign a very different agreement, one that would protect Antarctica from mining.
From the humble beginnings of a conversation on a Monday morning that said, well, come on, let's take this on, we can win this, and we did.
Look, I was young then. Yeah, sure, you'd heard a bit about Greenpeace and things like that, but here was an Australian Prime Minister putting a stake in the ground, and to be able to have the foresight that that needed to be done back then, when a lot of people were just looking at progress, 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 money, money, money. And that foresight has had a lot to do with where we're at the moment.
Hawke had delivered on the environment, but there were other Australians who were pinning their hopes on him.
I think in the 80s there was a great opportunity when Hawke had a lot of goodwill behind him, and giving back the land to Aboriginal people had reached an apogee, and he'd made some commitments.
That there would be national land rights.
We should have actually initiated very early on, while it was right, while the opportunity was there, legislation enacted.
Hawke was prepared for resistance to his push for land rights from the Conservative state governments, but the fiercest opposition came from his own party, the Labor government in the West.
How many seats are in danger, do you think?
Well, that's really a case of guessing, but I would think somewhere between 3 and 5 seats could be imperilled by wrong decisions in this area.
Backed by the Western Australian Premier, Brian Burke, mining companies launched a scare campaign.
You think it's fair that less than 3% of our population should claim ownership of up to 50% of our land?
I remember the Burke government and its feral response to the notion of national land rights and to the notion of treaty. And it was racist. It was so racist and so scaremongering.
Through Aboriginal land claims, your right of access to up to 50% of Western Australia could be taken away.
You could just feel the venom and the ugliness of that campaign.
Burke and others got to him, bad, no votes in this, you're going to do enormous harm. Some of his richer mates got to him, and at the end, he didn't do what he should have done.
Burke is happy because on this very day, Hawke has publicly backed his policy that placates the captains of industry by denying Aborigines total control over...
It needs to be done, and I'm doing it.
Instead, Australia went into its bicentennial, a divided nation.
I think it has suddenly dawned on everybody we've got 200 years to celebrate.
200 years of white settlement saw some of the biggest protests the nation had ever seen.
The last time in the 60s when they had crowds this big, it forced the government to pull the troops out of Vietnam. Let's hope we can force Bob Hawke to do something about Aboriginal people this time round, hey?
Under pressure, Bob would make a new promise to Indigenous Australia.
There shall be a treaty negotiated between the Aboriginal people and the government on behalf of all the people of Australia.
The treaty would officially acknowledge the unique rights of all Indigenous Australians. But again, Hawke failed to follow through.
I don't know what the answer is on why a leader like Bob Hawke, who revolutionised this country for us in many ways, didn't take that step to deliver his promise.
In a sense, I look to you, my Aboriginal friends, asking you to say yes, you've done well, but also please understand the sense of more could not have been done.
He failed. He failed not because his heart wasn't in it, he failed because his heart wasn't in enough. That's the worst thing to do in life. If you don't believe in things, you don't do them, that's fine. But you actually believe in things and don't do them, that's sadness.
I guess in hindsight, perhaps I could have tried harder, but overall, I just content myself with the view that the pluses very much outweigh the minuses that undoubtedly are there.
Bob had become Prime Minister, promising to bring Australia together. He'd won a record 4 elections, and his government had rescued us from recession.
We've turned the economy around from deep recession to a rate of growth which is one of the fastest in the Western world.
But by 1991, the world economy was tanking. And after years of growth, Australia was in trouble.
The signs of recession are everywhere. Empty shops, to let signs.
We didn't really understand the effects of a sudden deregulation of the banking sector. The money poured out and a lot of it went into the wrong hands.
These were sort of larrikin capitalists. A lot of really bad suits, ties, shoes, hairstyles.
We were all very naive and it ended up badly.
Many of these new tycoons had borrowed millions to build their empires. And as they went belly up, thousands of ordinary Australians lost jobs and life savings.
The fall has been so steep, the economy is now 0.7% behind its position 12 months ago.
If ever there was a time Bob's team needed to work together, it was now. Instead, his government would be torn apart by a power struggle between the PM and his heir apparent, Paul Keating.
We got distracted for a period, and that distraction was really, at the core of it, was Bob and Paul's relationship.
Bob had promised his ambitious treasurer he'd hand over the leadership after their fourth election. But when the time came, Bob reneged.
He said to me, and I remember the words exactly, he said, tell Paul that I want another 6 months. And I remember Keating looked at me and he said, fuck him. And that was that, as they say in the classics. It was on.
The battle is on. Hawke and Keating.
I've got a love affair with the people of this country. I just love being there as their Prime Minister, and I want to do it for quite a while yet.
Do you want his job, Mr.
While he's still a very, very effective chairman, there was a sense that he inevitably lost a bit of the puff, and that, Paul was entitled to have his place in the sun.
And Keating deserved an entry into the job that didn't have the poison. He wanted to be able to get the job without the blood. And it might have been hurting them, but I actually thought it was hurting the country more.
So here we are in the middle of a recession. 1 million people out of work. And yet, the federal politicians are locked in battle over a leadership challenge.
As the public suffered under a failing economy, Bob's fate was sealed.
Coming to you live from Parliament House, which has just seen easily the most dramatic day in its young history.
You've got to know when to go, and that's something that so many of them don't. It's the toughest trans being's weakest point.
Bob Hawke was never voted out by the Australian people. Instead, he became the first Labor Prime Minister to be kicked out by his own party.
But it's worth remembering, the guy was 72%. When he became Prime Minister, was 27% when we booted him out. I tried to persuade him to go, and he wouldn't. Had he gone when I told him he should go, he'd have gone out the absolute hero. The absolute hero. But he wouldn't do that. And of course, you're not a hero when you get blasted out of office. It ain't the same.
How do you want to be remembered by the people?
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
His eventual defeating Caucus was a heartbreaking thing for him, and heartbreaking for many of us to observe too.
I hope they still will think of me as the Bob Hawke that they got to know, the larrikin trade union leader who perhaps had sufficient common sense and intelligence to tone down his larrikinism to some extent and behave in a way that a Prime Minister should if he's going to be a proper representative of his people, but who, in the end, is essentially a dinky-die Australian.
You're hurt, but I was not heartbroken, if I can put it that way. Hurt, but not heartbroken.
Bob's last job as PM would be to hand in his resignation to the years earlier.
I had written a question I wanted to ask him, whether there was going to be something poignant about getting in the car and going off to Bill Hayden and Yarralumla. And somehow I couldn't get the question out. I could see that he was just holding it together. We were all so close. I could see Hazel's white knuckles, and I just felt it wasn't right.
Bob Hawke stepped down as Prime Minister on the 20th of December, 1991.
4 elections. That's amazing when you think about it, just plain amazing. And he was an extraordinary character, the like of which we hadn't seen before, and it looks like we won't see again.
He exuded something which I think was just authenticity. And I think if you're fair dinkum, people will listen to you and are attracted to you. But he was cheeky as well. And I found him to be the same, either on telly or on a one-to-one.
He wasn't just a steady-as-you-go Prime Minister. The job of running Australia is the hardest job there is. Bob did it extremely well for a very long time.
First time we will sing. This one's for you.
That's all we'll sing.
Solid. I will lead you in solidarity forever. Yes, yes. I'm sad to be leaving, but looking forward to... Bye-bye.
Reforms in education, reforms in the healthcare system, reforms in family payments and social payments, reforms in taxation policy, industry policy associated. His government produced modern Australia. For good or ill, it's modern Australia.
What is the future?
It's big.
This bloke deserved to walk away with people applauding and clapping forever. And I know the clapping and applauding has come back, but when he left, he deserved the applause, he deserved the clapping, he deserved the cheers. He warranted that by being a great Prime Minister for a long period.
More than 30 years in the public eye, Bob began a new life. He divorced Hazel and married his biographer. He also went back to having a beer and to being one of the mob.
There's an ex-Prime Minister of ours and a real favourite, loves his cricket, Bob Hawke.
It always happens at the cricket now, and I don't know, it's become a sort of friendly compact between me and the mob.
Each time they hear you talk, then you can remove the caucus and all bring to Bob Hawke, remove the caucus. The wonder of the down underdog, let's all bring to Bob Hawke.
Yeah, I'll go along with that.
The wonder of the down underdog, let's all bring to Bob Hawke.
So there.